Beautiful. Hello everyone. I hope we're all doing well. If you want to come and take a seat, we'll be starting now. Well, hello everyone. You're most welcome. My name's Mark. I'm a member of Warwick Christian Union here, but I'm also a member of the Warwick Christian Postgraduate and Staff Network. We're a society here on campus that seeks to evangelise to the different staff and postgrads here at Warwick, and we're very thankful to the Christian Union for allowing us to take one of the events in their week in order to give a talk ourselves. So yeah, we're very delighted to be joined by Dr. Martine Barons, who is a reader in statistics here at Warwick. She'll be giving a talk on evidence and what statistics can reveal about the claims of Christianity. This is the sort of thing that we at the Warwick CPS, Christian Postgraduate and Staff Network, like to do. We like to encourage different academics to think about how their work is related to their faith, how Christ can be seen and visible in all that we do, and especially in our research. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Martine for our talk.
Thank you very much, Mark. Can you hear me over the blowers? Excellent, excellent. So the first thing I want to say is you don't need to have a background in statistics to enjoy this talk. So if any of my statistics colleagues are in the audience, please know that there are simplifications, and you can talk to me about those afterwards. Okay. So what is statistics? It's a branch of mathematics. It deals with data, it deals with inference from data, models, those kind of things. It particularly talks about uncertainty. It talks about how you can quantify uncertainty, how you can account for it in your modeling. So what we can do is very simple stuff like evaluating alternative hypotheses. We can identify distributions. Are the distributions the same? For example, are the heights of men and women subject to a similar distribution? Are they completely different? Are they similar but perhaps shifted? So we can analyse the data, we can make use of the metadata, we can take into account the context of the data collections. All of those kinds of things can go into our modelling to try and find out more about the world. So one of the things we rely on statistics for is to evaluate medications and treatments. For example, is one medicine better than another? So we used to do things that is this medicine better than doing nothing, but now the paradigm is that we compare the new medicine against the best existing medicine. And we can do this with policies as well. We have a particular outcome in mind for our policy. We want to reduce poverty, for example. You know, if we do it this way, is it better than doing it that way? And by building some evidence-based modelling, we can actually anticipate which of these different policies are likely to get the outcome that we want. And there was a very famous case of Herceptin being discovered by subgroup analysis. So Herceptin was not very effective against cancer in general, but when somebody did the subgroup analysis, they found there was a particular type of patient that Herceptin was very, very strong for. So that the average effect was poor for this particular group, and it's gone on to be a very successful medication. So when we've actually done some statistics, we can help with individual decision making. For example, this is, should I take statins? Okay, probably not in most of this demographic, a particularly high priority question, but at some point we all get to this point. And what are we seeing with this pictograph? Well, we're seeing that 100 people, and 10 of them, so 100 people like you, they will say, 10 of them on the blue ones at the bottom are likely to get cardiovascular disease. If they all take statins, well, the 90 who were never going to get CVD anyway are still not going to get it. But 4 of the people who were going to get it no longer get it. So then you're making a decision, well, there are some side effects. Will I take it? Won't I take it? You have some information. And this itself is not a statistic. It's a presentation of a collection of statistics. So lots and lots of studies have been done. They've been gathered together in a meta-study, and all the evidence has been collated. And these will change as more information comes to light, perhaps as statins get better. Okay, so here's another one. So if you're invited for a breast screening, should you go? So what this pictograph is telling us, there's 100 people, they're dancing at the moment. And out of those 100, 4 will probably have cancer. The mammogram will pick up 3 of those. 1 person will get missed. But it will also pick up another 12 people who have cancer-like results, but will never get cancer. So this is a question of, well, do I go for my mammogram? Am I going to be one of the 12 that's going to suffer this unnecessary treatment? So this helps me to make a decision about whether I'm going to go for my screening or not. And here's one from the University of Warwick. So sometimes we have statistics for action and accountability. So this is the gender pay gap. Always a good fun game when it's a World Women's Day is to follow Twitter and to follow the Pay Gap app. Because every time an organisation posts about World Women's Day, it will actually give you automatically the gender pay gap for that particular organisation. So Warwick is not doing so well at the moment. It's at 20.3%. The average for the sector is around 14%. It says decreasing 5.6 percentage points since 2018-19 and 1.6 percentage points compared to the previous year, 2020-2021. Immediately I want to know what happened in the intervening year. Why are they not saying anything about that? Anyway. So one really interesting application of statistics recently, or relatively recently, has been the king in the car park. So hopefully you've all heard about the king in the car park. Really, really interesting. Leicester is not so far away. If you haven't been to the museum, I do recommend it. It's a lot of fun. So what happened was King Richard III was King of England. He was killed in the Battle of Bosworth. He was the last of the Yorkists, and he was disgraced because this was the 32-year War of the Roses, and he was the last person. Finally, the other house won, and so they kind of paraded him round and showed that they'd won finally. And then he got buried in haste, and he never had a sort of pomp and ceremony funeral because he was on the losing side. There was some evidence about he was probably buried in Greyfriars Priory, probably in the choir. Where that exactly was kind of vaguely known. Obviously we knew it was in Leicester, but the precise location wasn't known because it had all been knocked down in the dissolution of the monasteries. So there was one person, Philippa, who decided fairly recently that we're going to find King Richard III. I'm really keen on King Richard III. We're going to find his body. So they had to dig up bits of car park, which is why he's called the king in the car park, and miraculously they actually found him on the first day. But actually identifying this skeleton was not an easy process. And you see on the paper on the right, if you're interested in that, the identification of the remains of King Richard III. It's a full description of the Bayesian analysis they had to do to find out the odds ratio. So this is what the evidence that they had. They knew that the remains were likely to be in Greyfriars Church in Leicester. They found the skeleton, and it was a male between 30 and 34 years, so that fitted. But there's probably a lot of men between 30 and 34, had multiple battle injuries. Well, we just had the Battle of Bosworth. That doesn't really narrow it down a lot. It kind of rules it in, but it doesn't rule it out. Then we found this skeleton had severe scoliosis of the spine, and Richard III was known as a hunchback. So this kind of fitted with some of the documentary evidence they had about him. But again, nothing, not able to prove it. And then the radiocarbon dates fitted, so 1456 to 1530, and he died in 1485, so that would be about right. So 2 pieces of DNA evidence, the mitochondrial DNA from the female line and the Y chromosome data from the male line. Now, there was no match with the Y chromosome data, and they found at least one recent false paternity, as it's politely called. In other words, the person who's recorded as your father isn't your biological father, and there was at least 2 incidents of that. So that was evidence against this being Richard III. But then they had the mitochondrial DNA match with 2 female line relatives, and this was a rare type as well. So they had 2 hypotheses. This skeleton is the skeleton of Richard III. This skeleton is not the skeleton of Richard III. And they're able to do an odds ratio. So the probability of seeing this evidence given it is Richard III versus the probability of seeing this evidence given it's not Richard III. And you can imagine easily that in modern day court cases, a lot of stuff is probabilistic, the evidence, so you'll get the DNA evidence, the probability of a match, probability that this shoe print came from this particular shoe which belongs to this person, and you can do the same sort of exercise, the probability of seeing this evidence given the person, given the narrative provided by the prosecution, and the probability of seeing this evidence given the probability of the narrative provided by the defence. Of course, it doesn't mean in that particular case there isn't a third narrative which fits even better. But you can do the likelihood ratio for those things, although presenting it as a likelihood ratio to a jury is probably not, isn't the thing that they do, because then they'd have to just give a whole stats course on what is a likelihood ratio to every jury. But can we do something similar for the Christian faith? Now, I'm going to consider two hypotheses. Either the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as we find in any Bible that you can buy in any bookshop, are eyewitness testimony, based on eyewitness testimony, or they're not. So we can't do the full Bayesian analysis here, but we're going to think about some of the evidence. What is going to be the evidence? Well, we've got the Gospels themselves, what is actually written. We've got enough fragments of the original language to know what it says in the original. We have an English translation readily available to us. We have them online and so on. And then we're going to look at archaeology. What do we know from archaeology about places, about people, about customs, the shapes of buildings, those kinds of things? What did other people write down? People who were around at the time, not necessarily people who are friendly to Christianity, they may be hostile to Christianity, but we're going to have a look at all of the evidence there. We're going to think about geography, how the world is arranged, obviously, and botany, and agriculture and climate. So what do we know about those things, and how does that give us any evidence at all, whether these are eyewitness testimonies? Well, I'm going to start with names, because in my class at school, there were an awful lot of Susans. I haven't met a Susan for a long, long time. And fashions for names change. Now, I'm called Martine, it means warlike, do be warned. And there are very few of us around, at least in the UK. In France, there's a lot more of us. And I do occasionally spend some time looking into the global address list where I can see if I'm the only Martine, and most often I am. But you can see where this is leading, right? So all these names change in fashion, and they come into fashion and they go out of fashion. When my children were small, nobody had ever been called Luke for generations, and suddenly it was really fashionable. Now, if you were going to write a story about, and you were going to set it in Africa, and you gave all the characters Chinese names, that wouldn't seem very plausible, you know? And the same thing if you're going to write a historical novel or account about the UK, given that you live here, the names that were fashionable then are not the names that are fashionable now. So some kind of evidence about whether it's based on real fact or whether it's just made up can be inferred from the distribution of names. So we have some evidence which is relatively recent. So they've collected a lexicon of Jewish names. This is from 330 BCE to 200 CE, so 330 before the birth of Christ to 200 afterwards. So literary sources, records, graves, bone boxes, all those kind of names. And this is a book where if you want to check out the analysis of that, you can do that. Have to give you references, right? There we go. Oh, too far. Too far. Just right. Hey, there we go. So what do we find? For this era, the most popular male name was Simon or Simeon, sort of variant of the same name, okay? And then it's Joseph or Joses, and then it's Lazarus or Eliezer, so again the same name. So this is the ranking you can see on the left. Here are the male names. These are the total number of names we find in these different sources. The NT is the New Testament. Josephus was a historian that wrote at the time. The ossuaries are the bone boxes, so the names are on the bone boxes. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered 70s, I want to say. Yeah, so, well, within my lifetime, and I am very old, but anyway, so that was another writing from the time and giving us what the numbers of these names. So we can see that Simon and Simeon was the top name in the region at the time, also the top name in the New Testament, also the top name in the writings of Josephus, also the top name in the ossuaries, and the second name in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we can go down the list and we can say, actually, well, there's a correlation. Okay, so these things are consistent. Does it prove anything? No, it doesn't prove anything, absolutely. But it does give us evidence to think, well, actually, this is going on the side of, it's probably an eyewitness that wrote this, or somebody who'd spoken to an eyewitness who'd written this. So we can collapse the data, say, well, what about the top 2 and the top 9? So we can see that in Israel generally, the top 2, Simon and Joseph, were 15%, nearly 16%, and the Gospel and Acts, so that's the first book after the 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, so written about the early church, so that was 18%. The top 9 was 41% in Israel, 40.3% in the Gospel and Acts, so that's a fairly strong correlation. There was a lot less variety in what they call women's names. I think Mary and Salome was 28%, so there wasn't that much exciting novelty about being called Mary. And so that was 38. The numbers are smaller here, so there's more variability. But we can see that they're living in the same sort of space, okay? So where the sample sizes are large enough, these are statistically significant correlations. So if we were thinking about somewhere else, we would see a different pattern, okay? So the rank in Palestine versus the rank in Egypt. A lot of Israelites living in Egypt, and Eleazar's still doing pretty well, and Joseph is doing pretty well. But see that Sabbateus is almost, is very, very rare in Palestine compared to Egypt. And the same with Pappus and Ptolemaeus and Samuel at the bottom there. So why this is important is that the Gospels themselves were not written in Palestine. They were written in places like Syria and Rome. So if you were in Syria and Rome, you would not have Wikipedia, you would not have Google Maps, you would not have access to the information that we would have to be able to find out information independently. So if you're making it up, you'd have to think about what you were going to write. If you had actually been there, or somebody you know had been there and they talked to you about it, then you would have evidence for what was actually going on here. There we go. Now, what we find in the writings of the New Testament is disambiguation. Now, when I was doing my PhD, we had 3 Daniels, and 3 Daniels in a cohort of 10 people. So one had to be Dan, one had to be Daniel, and one had to be known by their last name, because otherwise we would never know who we were talking about. Now, you couldn't, in the time when the New Testament was written, go into a room and say, "Hey, Simon," because there'd probably be 10 of them, right? So what you find is when they're written down, Simon is a name that's disambiguated. So it's Simon Peter, Simon the Zealot, Simon the leper, Simon of Cyrene, Simon the tanner, and on it goes. So whenever you see something that's really common, it's disambiguated. When you see something that's not common, it is not disambiguated. So again, this leans towards saying the people were there, because that's what we do when we have a very common name. We disambiguate. We have a nickname. We have something else. Mary as well, we saw that huge numbers of women in New Testament times were called Mary, and almost universally they are disambiguated. So it's Mary, the mother of Jesus, it's Mary Magdalene, and so on and so forth. So other writings, for example, the apocryphal Gospels, which were writings about Jesus but may have been written a lot later, don't have these details. In fact, they actually use very few personal names at all. So that's one reason why there's actually a very distinct difference between those two sets of Gospels. There's also a very interesting narrator speech structure. So in reported speech, for example, John the Baptist will be called John the Baptist, not just John, because John is also a very common name. You'd need to, if you said, hey John, which John? So if you're familiar with the account of the beheading of John the Baptist, you'll know that the daughter did a dance and she said, what shall I ask for, Mum? And she said, ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter, which is kind of gruesome, but she had to go and say, I want the head of John the Baptist, because if she'd gone and said, I want the head of John, which John? She might have just got a servant or something like this. So we see a very consistent structure in things that are reported speech and things that are actually speech. And again, with people crying out, Jesus, son of David, have pity on me. So not just any old Jesus, because that was a common name. It's also the case that names are quite hard to remember. I don't know if any of you are just brilliant at remembering names. I'm not. I can go to a wedding or a party and get chatting to somebody I've never met before, and afterwards I can describe them, what they were wearing, how many children they had, where they went to school, what their job was, what was the favourite thing about their job, what was their favourite novel. I can remember all this stuff, but ask me what their name is and I can't remember. So if the writers are getting the difficult things right, it does suggest they actually knew these people, because it's easy to remember the names of people you know, right? So if you're writing about something that happened 10 years ago, you say, oh yeah, so-and-so was in my class, or so-and-so was in my group, or I was working with this person. So what do we conclude from this little foray into names? That the distribution of names, the way names are used in the New Testament, in the 4 canonical Gospels, are consistent with them being eyewitness testimony. It doesn't prove absolutely that they are, but there are other writings from the time, as I said, particularly the other Gospels, which don't have anything like this. Writings from different places don't have anything like this. So you could say, well, actually, just the people who wrote it down were extremely clever. But it's very hard, if you argue that, to then go and say they got it wrong because they were stupid. Okay, so you've got to choose one of those. Now, I like to travel, and I'm very privileged to travel with my job. And one of the things I notice is pavements. I don't know why I notice pavements, but I notice pavements. I was in Spain, and the pavements are all little tiny squares. And I thought, this is fascinating. Why did they do that rather than the big ones? It must take a lot longer to go down. It must be a lot bumpier for buggies and wheelchairs and things like this. But I always feel drawn for the differences. You notice these little things. And one time I went over to America and I discovered that the Cheesecake Factory is real. It's not just on Big Bang Thing. I've got to go there. And it was amazing, I have to say. The cheesecake was superb. I didn't eat anything else. I mean, why would you? But yes. So these are the things that stand out, things that are different from your own place. And things that you notice about your place. Or if you're writing your memoirs, you will know that there used to be a little house with a thatched roof on there, and they knocked it down in about 1973, and then they put 2 brick boxes and blah, blah, blah. All this kind of stuff is something you would never find on Wikipedia. It's something that you would know. So we have a similar pattern in the Gospels, because there's a lot of information about a lot of towns. So you would expect people who would know the capital. Nazareth was a little bit better known, was relatively well known, and Capernaum, but there were so many little villages that have no particular political or economic importance, like Bethany and Bethlehem, so you've got these references to these places. But other writings don't even include them. So again, the apocryphal Gospels, you might get a Nazareth, you might get a Jerusalem. You're not going to get any details about any of these places. Interestingly, the other thing about them is that they knew which ones were by the sea, which one was by the river, this one, whether this one was by a hill, whether it wasn't by a hill, and that kind of thing. All these little details are added in. They don't actually contribute anything to sort of telling you about Jesus, but they do kind of suggest strongly they were written down by somebody who was there or who was talking to somebody who was there. Okay. So all these little details do suggest strongly that these details were written down not because somebody needed to fill it out, but because it happened that way. Forgers would find it difficult to get the patterns right, even if they tried to put in, Bethsaida was by the sea or something like this. Getting that right when you hadn't been there and you hadn't talked to somebody who had would be incredibly difficult. So if anybody went to Sunday school, you know the song about Zacchaeus? A very little man and a very little man was he. Yeah? So Zacchaeus was a very little man. And what kind of tree did he climb? Sycamore tree. Were there sycamore trees in the town that he was? Where was he? He was in Jericho. Were the sycamore trees in Jericho? We can ask that question. Well, in Syria and Roman places where the Gospels were written, there were no sycamore trees. You wouldn't have seen a sycamore tree. You may not have known sycamore trees existed. But this detail is included, which strongly suggests that either the writer was there at the time when Zacchaeus climbed into a tree, or he had spoken to somebody who was. So, again, this is a small detail, but it's providing us, again, with more evidence on this side that the four Gospels in the Bible were written by eyewitness testimony. Okay, so the feeding of the 5,000, I'm not going to say here whether you think this really happened or not, but the incident, the claim, happened, is recorded in all four Gospels. Not every eyewitness account, not every Gospel includes every saying or every incident, but this is included in all four. And this is interesting because it's like a police case where you take evidence from lots of different witnesses and then you combine it and you find out more than you did from each of the individuals. So, first of all, one Gospel says it was Passover time. Okay, so there was a festival going on. Another Gospel will say there's much grass, or there was green grass. Now, if we know then it was Passover time, we know what time of year it was. We can check the climate and precipitation records or distributions for that part of the country or that part of the land at that time, and we find it's just at the end of the rainy season. So the reason there's a lot of grass, the reason there's a lot of green grass is because it just come to the end of the rainy season and it was flourishing. And it mentions that they were eating barley loaves. Why barley? Well, at that time of the year, they would have just had the barley harvest, and that again is consistent. Another Gospel says many people were coming and going, but doesn't say why. But if it was Passover time, that explains why a lot of people would be coming and going. Now, it mentions they were at Bethsaida, and then Jesus asks Philip, where shall we buy bread? Why him? Well, another Gospel says, well, actually, Philip and Andrew came from Bethsaida. Well, that would be why he would ask them in particular. So none of the Gospels on their own really tell the full story, but when we put it together, a bit like a police case, we can build up a whole picture. Now, if these were written by people who are making it up, they'd have had to do an awful lot of work to get that so consistent. So again, attention to these small details suggests the reliability of the main details. So other incidental details that we find in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, are about the shape of the houses. And archaeology tells us that indeed was the shape of the house, with the flat roofs and if somebody dug through and what the houses were made of. The kind of coins that they were in there, the kind of social stratification, the way the society was arranged, the shape of the temple, the religious settings, all these things are consistent with the evidence that we have. So if the Gospels result from conspiracy or incompetence, this is not what we would expect. So what is the weight of the evidence given this narrative? And what is the weight of the evidence given the narrative that these were fabricated, or these were written thousands of years after, or these were made up? They'd passed through several hundred different people, and so you wouldn't expect all this detail then. So if the Gospels were based on eyewitness testimony, this is what you would expect. So if we follow the evidence when we're thinking about whether to go for treatment or not, whether to take this medication or not, whether to adopt this policy or whatever, how are we going to follow the evidence here today? We can, of course, ignore it. We can, of course, object to it, or we can follow it. So if we follow the evidence, what are these four Gospels telling us? They're telling us that God made a perfect world with beings to live lives of joy. That's what God wants for us. He wants us to know Him and each other. He wants us to have the best life, really. But we chose to focus on ourselves instead, and we decided that we didn't need God in our life at all. And all the quarrelling that we have amongst ourselves, the injustice, and that's just an outworking of that. But God was not happy to let us go our own way, in the sense that He wanted to rescue us from having a second-rate life, because He wants us to have the best life. And so He entered the world and lived the life as a man, the man Jesus, and He wanted to deal with the causes of our broken relationship. So taking our bad rap, if you like, our bad results, He then took them on to Jesus, and Jesus paid the price that meant that we could be free. So we believe and rely on Jesus, and we get His record, which is perfect, and He takes our bad record. So that is a story that is being told by the four Gospels, which we've just shown are probably, almost certainly, eyewitness testimony. So if you were in the jury, which way would you fall on that? Okay? And what are you going to do with that evidence? Thank you.